Welcome to Bite-Sized L&D, your quick, no-nonsense update on the latest in workplace learning. Today, we're diving into how mastering debating techniques can transform your leadership skills and exploring the power of first principles thinking for strategic decision-making. All right, let's get straight into it.
Today, we're going to explore how mastering debating techniques can dramatically improve leadership skills and serve as powerful training for organizational leaders. Our guest is Yakov Lasker, an expert who has spent years teaching debate techniques not just to competitive debaters, but also to executives and leadership teams seeking to enhance their strategic thinking and communication abilities. As more organizations recognize the connection between structured argumentation and effective leadership, understanding these principles has become increasingly valuable. Welcome to our show, Yakov.
Thanks so much for having me, Donna. I'm really excited to discuss how debating skills translate into leadership excellence. Many people see debating as primarily a competitive activity, but I've found that the cognitive frameworks and communication techniques at the heart of good debating are transformative for leaders. The skills that make someone excel in a debate chamber are often the same ones that help them navigate complex leadership challenges and inspire their teams. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Let's start with the fundamentals. In competitive debating, defining parameters is crucial. How does this skill translate to leadership contexts, and why is it so valuable for leaders to master?
Definition skills are absolutely crucial for leaders. When leaders fail to properly frame issues or initiatives, confusion and misalignment inevitably follow. Effective leaders apply two key principles from debate: contextual understanding and purposeful framing. First, they consider context. What's happening in the organization, market, or industry that makes this issue relevant now? What recent developments or challenges are we responding to? Second, they clarify purpose. What specific outcome are we working toward? A good leader ensures that any discussion or initiative has sufficient scope and complexity to engage stakeholders meaningfully while remaining focused enough to drive action. When leaders master these framing skills, meetings become more productive, strategies more coherent, and teams more aligned around shared objectives.
That makes perfect sense. I've seen many leadership initiatives fail simply because they weren't properly framed at the outset. You also talk about hard and soft lines in debating. How do these concepts apply to leadership decision-making?
The hard-soft line concept is incredibly valuable for leaders thinking about change management and decision-making. In leadership contexts, a soft line represents incremental change to existing practices, while a hard line represents more transformational change. For instance, in addressing employee engagement issues, a soft line might involve tweaking the existing feedback system, while a hard line might mean implementing a completely new performance management philosophy. I advise leaders to generally aim for moderate to hard line approaches when driving meaningful change. Why? Soft line approaches often fail to generate sufficient energy or results to justify the effort, while still creating disruption. Hardline approaches, when properly executed, create philosophical consistency and appropriate scale. The solution matches the size of the challenge. Leaders who understand this concept make bolder, more coherent decisions while avoiding both incremental approaches that underdeliver and extreme positions that create unnecessary resistance.
That's fascinating. It reminds me of how the most effective leaders I've worked with aren't afraid to make substantial changes when needed. Moving to another concept, in debating, you emphasize the importance of models. How does model building translate to leadership?
In leadership, model building is essentially about creating structured frameworks that translate vision into actionable steps. Rather than just saying, "We need better innovation," an effective leader builds a model that specifies how innovation will be fostered, measured, and rewarded. It's the difference between advocating a concept and implementing a system. Leaders can build models in several ways. They might adopt existing frameworks from thought leaders or other organizations, adapt proven approaches to their specific context, or create completely new systems. The key is that the model provides clarity and structure. When introduced to a team, a good model frames the entire initiative, establishes priorities, and creates a common language for discussion. However, leaders should remember that models are tools to focus and structure effort, not ends in themselves. The analysis, execution, and adaptation that follow are what ultimately determine success.
That's a powerful way to think about translating vision into structured action. Now let's talk about first principles in argument construction. How can leaders apply this concept to strengthen their strategic thinking?
First principles thinking is perhaps the most valuable intellectual tool leaders can develop. There are two elements: understanding fundamental logical structures and recognizing the core concepts that define leadership challenges. Many leaders feel overwhelmed by the complexity of situations they face, but with strong first principles, you can build sound approaches to almost any challenge. For example, many leadership decisions revolve around fundamental tensions: short-term results versus long-term sustainability, centralized versus distributed authority, standardization versus customization. A leader with strong first principles recognizes these patterns and can analyze new situations through these lenses. When facing a novel challenge like implementing AI tools, they don't need to be AI experts. They can apply first principles about change management, skill development, and balancing efficiency with human judgment. This allows leaders to make sound decisions even in unfamiliar territory, which is increasingly valuable in our rapidly changing business environment.
That's incredibly useful. It's like having mental frameworks that help you navigate any situation. What about rebuttal techniques? How can leaders adapt these skills when receiving feedback or addressing opposing viewpoints?
Rebuttal skills are essential for leaders navigating disagreement and critical feedback. Effective leaders understand that an argument, whether from a team member, customer, or competitor, has three components: the main idea, the supporting analysis, and the evidence. The skilled leader can quickly identify which element is weakest and address it productively. I teach leaders 5 techniques from debate: identifying unsupported assertions, spotting logical contradictions, challenging inadequate causal links, revealing false dichotomies, and recognizing mischaracterizations of their position. Perhaps most powerful is what I call the even-if approach, acknowledging the validity of someone's concerns while demonstrating why your conclusion still stands. This technique builds psychological safety by showing respect for the other person's viewpoint while maintaining focus on the best path forward. Leaders who master these skills transform potential conflicts into collaborative problem solving, which dramatically improves decision quality and team cohesion.
Those techniques would definitely improve how leaders handle disagreement. You've also described case construction tactics in debating. How can leaders apply these to build more compelling strategic narratives?
Strategic narrative construction is critical for leadership effectiveness. 3 key debate tactics significantly improve how leaders build and communicate strategy. First, consider the order and roles in which information is presented. The most knowledgeable person on a topic should often provide context before detailed recommendations are shared, as this builds understanding before asking for decisions. Second, leaders should establish what I call filters, consistent principles that guide all aspects of a strategy or initiative. For example, a healthcare organization might use the filter: we will only implement changes that demonstrably improve patient outcomes to ensure consistency across all strategic elements. These filters create coherence and make it easier for teams to make aligned decisions independently. Third, make strategic concessions. Acknowledge where current approaches are working or where competitor strategies have merit. This builds credibility and focuses energy on the areas where change is truly needed. Leaders who apply these techniques develop strategies that are more coherent, easier to communicate, and ultimately more effective at driving organizational alignment.
These tactical considerations really highlight the strategic aspects of communication. You've also written about contextualizing cases using trends, norms, and tipping points. How can leaders use these concepts to create more compelling change narratives?
Creating a compelling context for change is perhaps the most underutilized leadership skill. Leaders often focus on the what and how of change without adequately addressing why change is needed now. Effective leaders use three contextual elements from debate to build momentum: trends, norms, and tipping points. Leaders who identify relevant trends, whether technological, market, or social, can position their initiatives as aligned with inevitable forces of change rather than arbitrary disruptions. Understanding norms helps leaders gauge how much explanation and support different stakeholders will need. Most powerfully, identifying tipping points, critical junctures where maintaining the status quo becomes more risky than changing, creates genuine urgency without manufacturing crisis. For example, a leader implementing new collaboration tools might connect this to trends in remote work, acknowledge current communication norms, and identify competitive disadvantages as a tipping point. This approach transforms change from something to be resisted into a necessary and timely response to real conditions. When done authentically, this type of contextualizing creates a powerful narrative that permeates all aspects of the change initiative.
That's so insightful. Speaking of mistakes to avoid, what are some common traps that leaders fall into when introducing new initiatives based on your debating experience?
Two classic traps stand out. The first is what I call the problem solutions gap. This happens when leaders compellingly describe a significant challenge, but then propose only minor adjustments in response. It's inconsistent and undermines credibility to passionately outline an existential threat and then recommend a small task force to study it. The more leaders emphasize the moral or strategic importance of an issue, the more substantive their proposed solution must be. The second common trap is the ultra-incremental approach, proposing changes so minimal they barely differ from the status quo. This creates problems because it neither generates enthusiasm nor produces meaningful results. It's the leadership equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. When faced with resistance, leaders often retreat to increasingly small changes. But this actually makes success less likely by signaling a lack of conviction and failing to create enough contrast with current conditions to be noticeable. Both these mistakes stem from leaders trying to play it too safe, but they end up weakening their position and diminishing their impact. Effective leaders match the scale of their solutions to the scale of the problems they identify.
Those are definitely pitfalls I've seen leaders stumble into. Beyond these specific errors, what are some general tactical mistakes that leaders at all levels should watch out for?
There are several common tactical mistakes I see repeatedly. One is the fallacy of either or thinking. Leaders present options as mutually exclusive when they aren't, unnecessarily limiting potential solutions. For example, assuming you must choose between quality and efficiency when both might be achievable through process redesign. Another mistake is treating stakeholder groups as homogeneous, assuming all customers, employees, or partners have identical needs and preferences when significant internal differences exist. A third error is what I call responsibility pushing, trying to make others accountable for problems or decisions that rightfully belong to the leader. Two other common mistakes are poorly constructed change narratives, which become mere assertions without proper analysis, and defensiveness about criticism, which blocks learning and improvement. Finally, getting entrenched in arguments about feasibility rather than desirability often wastes time and energy. Leaders who recognize these patterns can consciously avoid them, leading to more productive discussions and better decisions.
That's a comprehensive list of things to avoid. Let's talk about the performance aspect now. In debating, manner and delivery are crucial. How important is a leader's communication style, and what constitutes effective leadership presence?
Leadership presence is absolutely crucial to effectiveness. I consider it to have three key elements: persuasiveness, credibility, and conviction. Persuasiveness means making your message resonate with specific audiences, understanding their perspectives and priorities, recognizing when your ideas might seem counterintuitive to them, and adapting your communication accordingly. Credibility involves demonstrating competence and confidence without arrogance. Never undermine yourself with phrases like, "I'm not an expert," but it devastates your impact. If you're not knowledgeable about something, acknowledge it straightforwardly and explain your reasoning process instead. Finally, conviction means demonstrating authentic commitment to your message. The key distinction is communicating with the mindset. "I genuinely believe this is important," rather than "I need to win this argument." Effective leadership presence isn't about a particular style. Leaders can be quiet or energetic, analytical or emotional, but about authentic engagement with ideas and genuine commitment to moving the organization forward. When leaders combine these elements, their communication becomes transformative rather than merely informational.
I think that distinction between genuine conviction versus trying to win is so important. For more experienced leaders, you talk about advanced communication techniques like momentum and urgency. How do these concepts elevate a leader's impact?
Momentum and urgency transform leadership communication from competent to compelling. The aim is to create a narrative arc that shows why action is needed now rather than later. This goes beyond stating facts to generating emotional and intellectual investment in timely action. For issues directly connected to obvious crises like competitive threats or regulatory changes, this is relatively straightforward. But for evergreen challenges like improving collaboration or innovation, leaders need to connect these to broader contextual factors. For example, a leader might frame improved cross-functional collaboration not as a generic good practice, but as essential to addressing changing customer expectations and accelerating product development cycles. The key is consistency. Once you've established urgency, your communication, priorities, and resource allocation must all reflect it. Leaders who master this approach transform initiative fatigue into focused energy by making clear why this particular effort matters uniquely in this specific moment. This creates the narrative momentum necessary to overcome organizational inertia and sustain effort through inevitable challenges.
That's a sophisticated approach that really elevates leadership communication. You also discuss advanced analysis techniques. Could you share some insights on how leaders can deepen their critical thinking beyond obvious approaches?
Advanced analysis is what separates good leaders from exceptional ones. I teach three approaches that dramatically improve leadership thinking: perspective shifting, counterintuitive reasoning, and assumption reversal. Perspective shifting means deliberately examining issues from multiple stakeholder viewpoints, not just customers and employees, but also competitors, regulators, and even historical or future perspectives. For example, when considering automation, looking beyond efficiency gains to examine impacts on employee experience, skill development, and organizational culture. Counterintuitive reasoning involves exploring ideas that initially seem implausible, but might contain important insights. When presenting these ideas, leaders should acknowledge they may seem unusual, explain them carefully, and connect them to familiar concepts. For example, the counterintuitive notion that adding steps to a process might actually improve both quality and speed if those steps prevent costly rework. Assumption reversal is the most powerful technique, completely flipping core assumptions to generate breakthrough insights. For instance, instead of asking, "How can we better predict customer needs?" asking, "What if customers designed our products themselves?" These techniques help leaders break through conventional thinking patterns and develop truly innovative approaches to persistent challenges.
Those advanced techniques are fascinating. Let's take a step back and look at team dynamics. How important is consistency across leadership teams, and what strategies can leaders use to create a unified approach?
Leadership team alignment is often the difference between strategy execution and strategy failure. One approach I recommend is what I call collaborative framing, rather than traditional cascading communication. Instead of the CEO deciding direction and simply informing direct reports, leadership teams should collectively develop key frames and narratives, ensuring everyone deeply understands and authentically supports the direction. During implementation, having clear decision principles, similar to the filters I mentioned earlier, helps all leaders respond consistently to challenges and opportunities. It's also important to have explicit agreement on which points are non-negotiable versus areas where local adaptation is encouraged. Finally, leadership teams should understand their communication strategy and how each leader's role contributes to the overall narrative. Inconsistency between leaders is immediately visible to organizations and creates confusion, cynicism, and inaction. A leadership team that presents a genuinely unified front, not through rigid message control, but through shared understanding and commitment, creates the confidence necessary for organizations to embrace significant change.
That's so helpful for leadership teams to consider. Many leaders struggle with handling disagreement and criticism effectively. Could you provide some practical tips for developing more constructive approaches to opposition?
Handling disagreement effectively starts with good listening. You can't address concerns you haven't properly understood. When taking in criticism, identify not just what's being said, but the underlying structure. Is it based on disagreement about facts, priorities, or implications? Is it coming from concern about outcomes or about process? A technique I call productive engagement focuses on finding the most substantial element of the criticism and addressing it directly rather than getting defensive or dismissive. Remember that opposition typically contains three elements: factual claims, analytical reasoning, and values or priorities. While challenging facts might be easiest, it's rarely most productive. Instead, acknowledge valid concerns while redirecting the conversation towards shared objectives and alternative approaches. Also, don't feel obligated to address every point of criticism. Prioritize the concerns that matter most to key stakeholders or that identify genuine risks. Sometimes, strategic concessions on secondary issues create the trust needed to move forward on primary ones. And never forget the power of yes and thinking. Accepting the validity of concerns while expanding the conversation to include additional considerations often leads to better solutions than either your original proposal or the criticism alone would generate.
Those are really practical strategies for handling opposition constructively. Let's talk about preparation. How should leaders structure their approach to important communications or strategic decisions?
Preparation for major leadership moments should be strategic and comprehensive. I recommend a different approach than the typical draft slides, then practice presenting method. Start by identifying the core tension or opportunity at the heart of the situation. Understand what makes this moment significant and what's truly at stake for various stakeholders. Then formulate a clear central proposition that addresses this tension and creates genuine choice. Next, establish the context and parameters, explaining not just what you're proposing, but why this particular framing is appropriate. Develop your key arguments, then rigorously test them by anticipating objections and concerns. Eliminate arguments that don't withstand scrutiny and strengthen those that remain. Finally, create a communication structure that presents your thinking in a logical progression that builds understanding before asking for commitment. The key difference in my approach is integrating analytical and communication preparation rather than treating them as separate activities. Leaders should develop content and approach simultaneously, constantly testing whether their reasoning is sound and whether it will resonate with their specific audience. This creates communications that are both substantively strong and genuinely persuasive.
That sounds much more integrated than how many leaders approach important communications. Switching focus slightly, How should leaders approach situations where they have limited expertise but still need to make decisions?
This is where first principles become invaluable and increasingly common as leaders face decisions about emerging technologies or entering unfamiliar markets. When faced with an expertise gap, don't panic or fake knowledge. Start by identifying what type of situation this is. Is it primarily about risk management, innovation, talent development, or change management? Once categorized, you can apply relevant leadership principles. For example, if considering implementing blockchain technology without being a technical expert, you can apply principles about adoption of innovative systems, pilot before scaling, ensure strong user involvement, balance enthusiasts with skeptics on the team, and create clear success metrics. Focus on the leadership aspects rather than technical details, which others can provide. Be transparent about your approach. Don't pretend to have technical expertise you lack, but be confident in your leadership expertise. Ask clarifying questions that reveal underlying assumptions and implications rather than technical specifications. And when experts make claims you can't directly verify, analyze whether their conclusions would logically follow, even if their technical assertions are accurate. This approach allows you to lead effectively even in domains where you aren't personally expert.
That's so empowering for leaders facing increasingly complex technical decisions. For those developing leadership programs, what key aspects of debate training should they consider incorporating?
Leadership development programs should incorporate 5 key elements from debate training. First, structured thinking exercises that require leaders to identify the precise disagreement in complex situations rather than just advocating positions. Second, framing practice, having leaders explain the same initiative to different stakeholders, adapting their approach while maintaining consistent substance. Third, constructive opposition training, practicing the art of challenging ideas to make them stronger without creating defensiveness. Fourth, first principles workshops that help leaders identify the fundamental concepts and tensions underlying their specific organizational challenges. Finally, deliberate practice with feedback on both reasoning and communication effectiveness. Effective programs recognize that debate skills aren't about creating conflict, but about bringing intellectual discipline to how we explore ideas and make decisions. They teach leaders that the goal isn't winning arguments, but generating the best possible thinking. And they understand that while individual brilliance can be impressive, leadership effectiveness ultimately depends on creating shared understanding and collective commitment to well-reasoned courses of action.
Those are excellent guidelines for leadership development professionals. As we near the end of our conversation, what advice would you give to leaders who want to move from good to truly exceptional in their critical thinking and communication?
The journey from good to exceptional leadership thinking requires both skill development and mindset evolution. Technically, focus on mastering first principles rather than accumulating tactical knowledge. Develop comfort with exploring multiple perspectives and practice generating deeper analysis through the techniques we discussed. But the mindset shift is equally important. Exceptional leaders approach communication thinking, how can I advance understanding? Rather than, how can I sell my idea? They genuinely engage with complex issues rather than simplifying prematurely. They're willing to explore counterintuitive thinking rather than sticking to conventional wisdom. And they see leadership communication not just as information transfer, but as meaning-making with their organizations. Finally, exceptional leaders understand that while immediate results matter, their most enduring impact comes from elevating the quality of thinking throughout their organizations. As I often say, leadership done well shapes not just outcomes but organizational culture, intellectual rigor, and collective capabilities. That's why developing these skills matters so profoundly.
That's a wonderful perspective on the deeper value of leadership development. For our final question, what's the single most important piece of advice you would give to leaders looking to incorporate debate-based thinking into their approach?
If I had to give just one piece of advice, it would be this: focus on improving the quality of thinking rather than winning the point. This might sound obvious, but it's transformative in practice. When leaders become fixated on having their ideas adopted, they often resort to authority, political maneuvering, or superficial persuasion. But when they focus on generating the best possible thinking, regardless of where ideas originate, they create psychological safety that unlocks organizational intelligence. This approach makes leadership more effective and sustainable. You'll learn more from a meeting where robust, respectful debate led to a better solution than your original idea, than from one where your initial proposal was quickly approved but poorly implemented. Remember the distinction I make between two types of leaders: those who see communication as a tool to get their way, versus those who see it as a process for discovering the best way forward. The second type builds not just better solutions, but stronger organizations capable of tackling increasingly complex challenges.
That's profound advice that applies across all leadership contexts. Yakov, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. This has been an illuminating conversation about how debate principles can elevate leadership effectiveness.
Thank you, Donna. It's been a pleasure discussing these ideas with you. I hope your listeners find these principles helpful, whether they're designing leadership development programs or seeking to enhance their own leadership capabilities. The intellectual disciplines from debate may have their roots in academic competition, but they're absolutely essential for leaders navigating today's complex challenges. When organizations develop these capabilities systematically, they don't just perform better. They become environments where both people and ideas flourish. And that's a wrap for today's podcast. Remember, mastering debating techniques can greatly enhance your leadership skills by fostering clarity, strategic thinking, and effective communication. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends and colleagues so they can also stay updated on the latest news and gain powerful insights. Stay tuned for more updates.